Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Fear Files. Here we go again, my friends. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Here we are on our last Sunday, the calm before the storm, the last Sunday before the NFL season kicks off properly. Tweeting out, just so everyone can find their way into the room. And let's talk some business here. So episode 2 of Fear Files, Sharpening the Edge. Episode 2, I'm already scared. Hopefully it's better than Attack of the Clones. But understanding your strengths and weaknesses as a DFS player, as well as learning how to best profit from those strengths and protect yourself from those weaknesses. So yeah, we're going to talk about Edge today. Not talking about Adam Copeland, the estimable professional wrestler, or David Howell Evans, the full name of The Edge, from U2, who uses the defining article. Not going to talk about those today, although if we run out of show topics before NBA starts, certainly possible. But no, it's about knowing your strengths, and there's a real inverse corollary here that's true as well, that you need to be able to identify your weaknesses and defend against them. And I don't want to go too much into the whole game theory heuristic side of it, so let's start with a good example. A lot of people who play in DFS find that they win more frequently on one site than perhaps they do on another. And certainly, especially at the beginning, this can have something to do with just small sample size. This can just be some noise, but especially as your sample size creeps up, it usually isn't, and this is something that really helps you identify potentially strengths and weaknesses. So let me give a couple examples here as we file up the chat connective server. So, for example, lineup building on FanDuel versus DraftKings versus, say, Yahoo are really different and disparate experiences that use somewhat different skills. The rigidity of FanDuel, the lack of flexible positions, really advantages those who are best able to detect and take advantage of positional scarcity, or something I like to call relative positional value. One example of that, let's say you're playing NBA, and while shooting guard is frequently a pay down position, you look at a small or a medium slate and you say, you know what, I really think DeMar DeRozan's going to get me 35 points tonight, and I'm not that happy with anyone else at this position, and I really like the matchup. And, you know, while his price at $8,400 in a vacuum is a bit higher than I want to pay for the production I expect out of him, due to the way the other positions break down tonight and the lack of other options there, I'm going to pay up because I think there's a real chance that it profits me 15 or 20 points versus 90% of the people in the field who aren't going to play that number. And there's other guys at other positions I like more at that price, but I'm going there. I'm going to pay up a little for DeRozan. And then, you know, positional awareness is a great skill that does far, far less for you when you're playing on, say, DraftKings or on Yahoo. Those sites have enough positional flexibility. Those sites have enough there's, you know, one site you have point guard, shooting guard, guard. There's enough flex spots where you're much more advantaged to knowing simple production, and having better projections is more important, and of course estimating ownership. Yahoo would have the additional wrinkle of the far more unique pricing structure. FanDuel and DraftKings mirror each other pretty closely. Yahoo is much different. It has a relatively lower tax on all the players, which makes minimum prices much more attractive in parallel. So let's say we're talking about you know, FanDuel, for example, you're playing 9 players in basketball, and for a lot of the year it has a minimum price usually of, say, $3,500 per player out of your $60,000 cap. Well, that means that they've actually spent 9 times $3,500, which is $31,500 for you before you even get started. On Yahoo, they spend a lot less of your money, and the functional $10 floor there really changes things around, making bargain players inherently better. And this effect is also compounded by the fact that Yahoo is a little bit less accurate as far as their pricing goes, and a little less reactive to changes. And all this means that if you are building optimally, you should end up with stars and scrubs, or at least more scrubs, on Yahoo, and you should be playing more minimum price guys there than you were on the other sites. And I want to touch on improvement really quickly as a concept. This is a show unto itself that could go an hour, but to spend 2 minutes on it here, Tyler Durden said to us that self-improvement is masturbation. I'm not necessarily sure about that, but it's important to not, especially when you get good at it and start making some money, give up on continuing to improve your game. Again, not everybody approaches daily fantasy sports with a laser focus determined to make all the money in the world so that they can then quit their day job and analyze their performance. And the vast majority are far more casual about the pursuit. And if you're one of those, that's great. Have a good time. I'm sure you know what you're doing, and it's an absolutely fine way to basically spend some money to enjoy your sports a little bit more. And if all the casual people gave up or got super serious, the entire playing environment would fold up like a house of cards. But if you are one of those few brave souls driven to excellence, it's important to keep seeking to improve. I have a big pet peeve of people who are good at something, maybe really good, and stagnate in an endeavor of any sort: music, business, DFS, gaming, athletics. And it's whenever you are bad at something, you usually either quit or figure out why you're bad and get better. You continue to improve. And there's a sort of woeful human tendency to, when you are doing pretty well or start doing well at something, to become content and never go from good to great. And the last thing I'll say about this is to talk about attitude for a little bit. Some of this reflects itself in an attitude towards failure. DFS reminds me a lot of a couple other things. Poker and competitive gaming like Magic the Gathering, or competitive board gaming and other geeky things I've done, and where I see a huge amount of players reach a certain level and just entirely stagnate. And one of the reasons why is their attitude towards bad beats or losing. Really good players. But great players fail or succeed less spectacularly than they could have, and they really review what happened. Did they make the right call, even if they got outdrawn on the river and got unlucky? Did they make the right call to call on the turn? Was that right? Was I right to lightning bolt at the end of your turn instead of during your upkeep? Was I right to have really faded that chalk guy in retrospect? So beware of that trap. Doing okay, making some money, and just stagnate and never improve. Perform, just sort of an honest self-inventory. How often do you find yourself looking back at the last day's slate of games and thinking, oh, I made a mistake there? Sitting there, are you, thinking, did I do that right? Or are you just moving on to the next day, setting your lineups and saying, oh, shit, I got unlucky? Are you always unlucky when you lose? So worth considering. If you never, I guess the big point is, if you always consider all your losses bad beats, and you will never improve as a player, almost by definition, because you are denying yourself the opportunity to do so. You just got to, on a scale of 1 to 100, you got to a 97, and you've decided every time you lose from now on is bad luck. You'll never get any better. So another relevant NFL example came up the other day. I was squatting on a Twitch chat of my another of my former erstwhile colleagues, the stunningly handsome Manny Laura, and they were having a discussion on NFL stacking and when it is right to do so and when it isn't. And I briefly opined that it makes much more sense always to stack on FanDuel than it does on DraftKings. And Manny, who has a very good intuitive sense of mathematics, said yes, of course. But I had several people ask me to explain that or just didn't get it, and this is a good example of again, just sort of intuitive mathematical understanding. On Twitter, Jordan Cooper, who writes for, I think I have this wrong, but RotoWire Soccer, I think it is, apologies if I got that wrong, has an ongoing spout with this ridiculous blowhard Fantasy Supreme guy who, among his other bloviations, recently tweeted that his cash rate for this MLB season was 91%. And, if you hear that and don't immediately write that person off forever, you should find a different hobby than DFS just because you have no just sort of understanding of math on any fundamental level. My favorite part of that is, were that to be the truth, the only excuse you would not have for having millions and millions of dollars would be that your bankroll management is absolutely ridiculous. There's absolutely no... If you're winning 91% of your games, and you can play this sport for... MLB's been going for what? We're on 5 months now? and you've managed to get that far, and you don't have millions of dollars, you're betting 1% of your bankroll. There's literally almost no other way that could happen. So, but the same thing when you talk about, why are stacks more valid on FanDuel than DraftKings? Mostly, there's a couple of reasons. The pricing affects it as well, but it's because the full PPR and the 100-yard bonuses on DraftKings make it proportionately much more likely that a receiver can have a good game without his quarterback necessarily doing so. On FanDuel, that happens far less. That you have, their object example specifically was Antonio Brown and go off and have a huge game without Ben Roethlisberger doing it, because it's much harder for Antonio Brown to have a big game, what would be considered a big game relative to the other receivers, on FanDuel without finding the end zone a couple times. So, long story short, if you built 100 lineups on FanDuel, 100 lineups on DraftKings, if you're doing it right, you would probably look at them and find more quarterback wide receiver stacking on FanDuel. Mathematically, that should be a truism there. I think that would be a good rubric. So mathematically, edge is easier to manage in certain spots. In blackjack, it's a known quantity. Again, depending where you're playing in the rules, the house edge is 0.5% to 1%, depending on whether they're showing you cut cards and various other little nuances if you play perfect basic blackjack. When you start metagaming, which in this case is most frequently counting cards, you can still calculate to a certainty what that edge is as you continue to play. If you're counting 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 decks, whatever your positive count gets up to, any decent blackjack chart can tell you exactly what percentage their advantage or close to it based on the size of the shoe and what the count is. There's really no such certainty in DFS because the edge you're trying to overcome is not as easily quantifiable, nor can you really quantify the steps you're taking. But that edge is still present, and you need to be just aware of the concept and something you're constantly attacking. So we'll go through a couple more specific possibilities, and then certainly take any questions anyone has. A couple other DFS applications here and strengths and weaknesses you see frequently. Do you find yourself frequently surprised by ownership? Does a slate finish and you often find yourself looking at results and thinking, wow, that guy was 45% owned, he really wasn't on my radar, or just I didn't expect that? Then you have a weakness in research. Maybe you aren't perusing the right sites, maybe you don't have enough time, maybe you're not doing the right things on Twitter, which is an important tool, maybe you're subscribed to the wrong place, is certainly possible. But especially if you're playing a lot of GPPs, which is the most frequent user behavior these days, that's a process edge that you are giving up. You likely have a hole in your research game, and if you aren't figuring out ownerships and stuff, that's basically the whole ball game. If you're not playing, if you're playing mostly guaranteed contests, do you find yourself profiting most frequently in cash and rarely in GPPs? You at some point have to consider, as your sample size gets bigger, don't fight it to chase the action. Take what's given. How is your process? Do you find yourself missing out on promotions and overlay? That's an important thing in reducing that edge. Figure out where that sort of thing is posted. Set some alarms, set some alerts. Another process point that then isn't given enough attention is changing your exposure when your edge is better. Harkening back to the blackjack example from 5 minutes ago, varying the size of your wager depending on your edge at any given time is basically the whole reason that works at all. But a staggering number of DFS players, the vast majority who I speak to, have no mechanism in place to do the same thing. I'm generally on up until lock NBA, 200 days a year or something like that. And 8, 10, 12, 15, 17 of those days end up making or breaking the whole year, where player X goes out at 648 or 652 or 657, and player Y is now a tremendous play, and there's appropriate pivots and switches to be made, which we try to get out as quickly as possible. Many or most players even have a plan in place to make those appropriate changes in their existing exposure, and that's an absolutely critical step of your process you need to have if you are crunching, playing a lot of lineups, playing MME. But the additional component that has real, consistent, relative merit that almost no one has in place is a plan to get more chips on the table. Again, you're counting a deck of blackjack. I got a plus 20 natural count. I'm playing $500 a hand instead of $50 a hand. Very few people who I've spoken to, and I ask this exact question because I try to talk to successful players all the time, and even most of them don't have a really refined plan when they feel similarly advantaged to get more chips on the table. And they should, and most of you know you should, and you'll follow that behavior in the event of there being overlay. You're going to be looking at week 1 of NFL coming up, there's going to be overlay some places. And people will very frequently be like, oh, I was only going to join that contest once, but it's going to take in whatever, $3 million and pay out $4 million or whatever the exact number is, so I'm going to max enter that sucker. So everyone understands that the point. But in a similar situation where, hey, 3 pieces of really good news broke between 6:45 and 6:55 today. I like my teams a lot more than I did before. I think that I've got some better bargain plays that won't be as highly owned as they would be in a vacuum if this news had come out earlier. I think there's going to be more dead money in the field from people who have those players who got announced out late. I'm going to quickly but efficiently get more chips on the table. Well, how do you do that? You ever practiced it? Like, how many sites do you play? 1 or 2 sites? Do you know how to? You have 30 seconds. How do you get, you have $1,000 in play, how do you get $2,000 more in play? Where are you looking? Do you always have the lobby up? Is it going to the head-to-head screen? What's your, and I don't know, again, I haven't done this in a couple years. I'm not allowed to play anymore because I work in the industry, but do you have a plan? Because I think you should have a plan. Very few people have that plan. So again, that's, that's another process edge. And we could, sit here for a while and go through a few more, but just to summarize, you should always, it's like playing basketball. I mean, there's edge in everything from, war to business to basketball to poker to blackjack to anything else you might do that's some sort of adversarial situation like that. And, it's not a bad idea to step back and take a view of a situation and understand where you are advantaged and where you are disadvantaged. So, there's a fair number of questions, so I will get in and handle some questions real quick. How about knowing your opponent's strengths and weaknesses and playing to them? Well, yeah, it doesn't apply as much as I'd like for the DFS conversation, because the majority of contest people are playing are interested in usually aren't one-on-ones, and even when you are playing a lot of head-to-heads, it's rarely against the same opponent frequently enough that you learn enough about them that you can define them and analyze them quantitatively. But sure, I mean, there's basketball and baseball. You can talk about BVP. That's always a fun conversation. But you develop strategies to beat people specifically. Like, I've gotten old enough now. I still love playing basketball, but I'm slow enough and my handle is still not great enough that I really can't get around anyone who's at least medium speed. So the guys who know how to play me best, if they're of any decent size, 6 feet or over, just get right up in my face, and I can't do much. My shot release isn't that quick that I can shoot over these guys, and I can't drive around them, so if they just literally get right up in my grill, I just check out on offense. Try to play really good defense, set a million picks, but, I know my limitations. So, Trojan War, the Greek army was better, stronger, faster. They travel all the way across the sea to, I think Troy was in modern-day Turkey, so they would have gone west across the Aegean Sea, and they have this several thousand-mile-long supply chain, which is really not easy to handle thousands of years ago. So the Trojans just had these, 50-foot high walls around the city of Troy, according to legend, and they just sat behind them. So the only way to get around that advantage was to get invited in. They built the Trojan horse, and poof. So there's an example. I would add to this point immediately that when you realize an edge, add contests you want and try to get in whatever contest you like that is the most filled. Sure, there's a million potential applications here, but it's and this all plays into game theory, and these are all conjoined subjects, which is why I end up mentioning episode 1 on episode 2, and we'll try to build on that in episode 3. So yeah, so any further questions? I'm looking at the chat here. I did not run this on my personal Periscope today, for which I imagine there's some great consternation on the Twitter sphere, but I'm trying to drag people to the Osmo there. I do see Jordan Cooper in here hanging out. I appreciate that. Do you use a cruncher? I again am not allowed to play anymore. I never used a cruncher. Now I've been stopped from playing for since Ethan Gate, which I think was late 2015. So you're looking at not quite 3 years, but coming up on it. And no, there were rare times I'd have more than say 20 entries into a tournament. It happened where there was really overlay. NFL Week 1 is a good example where I would pile in a massive amount of entries, but I always built them all by hand. But I definitely, there are very few edges left. It's a really, a lot of fish are out of the ecosystem, and it's difficult to overcome the adverse edge of the fact that the rake is so massive right now. So, how exactly can we get about doing that? And mass multi-entry is one of those. One lineup can be pretty well optimized by a person. And it is very difficult one lineupping and head-to-heading and caching to get ahead of that rake, although the rake is lower in cache contest, which is incredibly relevant. And it's the reason the rake is lower, by the way. GPPs people will pay for. They're trying to get lucky. They're trying to win $1 million. They'll pay the extra nut. Head-to-heads, you bump the rake on those from 10, 12 to 15, 16%, they will die out, and you'll start to carve out the bottom of your ecosystem pyramid, and the whole thing will collapse on itself. So, yeah, I think it's certainly important to, keep an eye on what you can do well. There will be offers trying to do the same as you. Generally, people entering head-to-heads or even late contests have more updated news. Yeah, again, knowing your opponent is incredibly valuable. Ricky Geiger here does some fine writing himself. Comments. Yeah, but playing the late slates, is a different population of people playing the main slates. When reviewing previous slates, do you think deconstructing the winning lineup instead of the best lineup possible is improper? I've never been asked that question before. That's a good one. The best lineup possible would strike me like I would want to do both, and I can think of very little reason you wouldn't do both, because I imagine the dissimilarities between the two would be limited to 2 positions most times. This obviously depends on the size of the slate and how many people are playing, but if you look at the nut DraftKings lineup after this coming Sunday's hoo-ha, I imagine it'll be fairly close to the best one that was actually submitted. But yeah, I would want to see best possible a little more than I'd want to see whatever won. But I would think ideally you would look at both of them. Most top players try to enter cash or post head-heads as quickly as possible at the slate in the hopes they play against people less likely to react to late news because they set their lineups early. That's a very good point. And again, this is process. Process is important. People talk about who's good at DFS. A lot of being good at DFS is having a good process, managing against your weaknesses, for example. One of the disadvantages of mass multi-entering or playing on 7 sites that I used to play on every single day for years was the inability to react efficiently to news. So you really have to have, a fire drill in fucking place for, okay, I'm playing 7 sites, news comes out at 6:58. How do I execute that? I'm, crunching 150 lineups. Be as familiar as you possibly can with how to fix that. Because fixing those 150 lineups can be, your whole month's profit up or down. You make that change, you get a guy who should be 30% owned in a vacuum, you got him at 2% owned, you make a pile of money that night. Oh, you didn't get that change in? You lost your whole investment that night. That's a pretty big swing. So it doesn't get spoken about as much as it should, and maybe I'll do an entire process show because there's many different ways, people's processes can be improved. But that's another one. The best lineup has an inherent issue behind it. Kyle O'Quinn will be in it after dropping 32 FanDuel points, not because it's a great matchup for him, but because Porzingis left that game in the first. Yes, that's why I think there's merit to looking at both of them. Frequently, the best possible lineup will contain something that is irrelevant because the only way you could have made that play was to have information that was not possibly available to you. I do concede your point there. Baseball best possible lineup is probably the most relevant. Due to the paucity of injury, that seems right to me. That seems correct. It's about 40-50 points off on a daily basis. Okay, again, you're talking about daily baseball, which, again, the pools are a little differently, whatever. I was thinking more basketball, which has more repeatable scoring, or football, but I believe it's significantly off. Any further questions? We got out of here in 25 minutes this time. Last time it was about an hour. 4 3K guys could hit 2 homers, and the optimal could have 7K on the table. Yeah, NBA rarely has hidden plays that are actually that good. Yeah, that makes sense. Again, NBA is simply a far more predictable sport than baseball. In baseball, you can have guys who are almost worthless blow up for 60 or 70. Rarely do you get that 50-point CJ Miles game, though it does happen, but it happens pretty regular occurrence in MLB. And again, the biggest reason why is just sample size and size of scoring. In MLB, you can do a massive, massive thing all at once. In NBA, you can like get fouled while making a 3-pointer and make the free throw and get 4.5 points. That's about as good as you get. Or maybe get a steal and make a 3-pointer and get 5.5 points. But you know, in baseball, you're throwing up giant buckets of points, and in basketball, you have 100 opportunities to score. In baseball, you have like 5. So the combination of those two things, again, makes baseball just simply a more predictable enterprise. Jordan Cooper says, I think too many people get wrapped up into what tools with optimizers, what projections, etc., rather than the hows and whys of DFS strategies you're looking to accomplish with them. I think that's absolutely the case. You have to have a motivation. And again, I would question... I work for Osimo now, who has made vast, vast sums of money, for whom mathematical projections and efficiently monetizing and using MME to his vast advantage are, I believe it's safe to say, the largest reason for his success. I do think he also has a good head for sports. I also think he's incredibly intelligent. But with rare exception, it would seem strange for me, especially in more popular sports, for projections to ever be good enough to overcome the rake edge. Like, how many sets of football projections are out there? I don't even know. 500? Infinite sets. And absolutely have good projections. Absolutely some of them are better than others. But your projection would need to be leaps and goddamn bounds better than someone else's to somehow just be like, you know what, I'm just entering the same random contests, but my edge is just that my projections are better, and that's how I'm going to overcome 15% rake. No, it's not. I'll just shoot that down right out of there. You need something else, especially in football, which is much more of a solved equation than other sports. Baseball's pretty well solved too, but basketball and hockey with real time, they're not as statistically structured into the firmament that we know exactly what is what, that there isn't more of an edge to be gained there in having better stats. But like, we're actually at the point where more stats might be diminutive to baseball and football, because I honestly think the biggest issue in fantasy sports these days isn't having the right stats, it's knowing how to weight your stats. Like, do you have any idea, if I looked at today's baseball slate, you guys have a better idea than I do probably on the whole, how many stats there are to quantify and qualify these guys? From, you know, park factors to xFIP to umpire ratings to all these various things that are going on. How the hell do you weight those? It's very easy to look at a player, and I can give you 5 stats that make him look like the best player on the slate and 5 stats that make him look on the worst player on the slate. So how do you combine the 10, 12, 16, 22, 97 stats you're using to look at the slate and appropriately weight all those statistics? And every time a new stat comes out, now it's something else I'm trying to weight. So it's almost at the point where I think the more information you're getting about these sports are actually more distortive than they are constructive. Best possible lineup scored 368. Winning lineup in the $8 was 340. Okay. What will I be doing at Osimo? Same as FanVice. Similar. We're working on it. I'm going to do some more of this for the next 3.5 weeks or so until basketball comes out. Hopefully provide some quality content. Build a following. Appear in front of the paywall for a while to bring back, a few years ago at a different job, I had 5,000 people who watched me, and it was fairly successful, and I'm hoping to grab some of those people back. But we still need to figure out the exact schedule, who's writing, who's showing, who's in front of the paywall, who's behind, when, and there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to those plans. So stay tuned. We'll certainly announce a plan when we have it. Do you have to pay for ownership percentage? Well, you can answer that better than anyone else could. You need ownership percentage if you're going to play guaranteed tournaments successfully. So if you can't figure it out yourself fairly well, then you need to pay for it. Now, I spend so much time reading about basketball and reading Twitter and reading all the beat reporters and reading what everyone else says all day that I generally have a very, very good grasp on ownership. We used to end the shows at FanVice 5 days a week with me guessing the ownership, and I was fairly good at it, I feel safe in saying. I don't think I would have needed to pay for ownership. But unless I felt like I had a really good grasp on it, it's probably the most important thing. You need to be a quality. Ownership is, in theory, more important than production. Obviously, it's not apples to apples, but ownership is really important. So you need it. If you feel you can get it without paying for it, I have no doubt that many people can. So it's really sort of a personal question. 11/28/2017. Oh, we're talking about old basketball sites. Biggest process thing when looking at a top lineup plays is always checking, did I think about this player? Did I miss something? Was this a process issue? Yes, I agree entirely. At the end of the day, no matter how much research you do, how much data is involved, there's no way to know what's going to happen. I'm trying to find the balance between data and process. Well, data and process aren't necessarily antonyms in this context. I would say data and sort of sports knowledge end up being the most antonymical of the two things. And it's always been funny for me in basketball, of all the people who tout basketball, I think I end up using math far less than most of them, which is weird because I'm a giant math guy. I love math. I dig math. I look at everything in terms of probability and game theory. But the way in which I separate myself, again, you're talking about advantages and disadvantages, I'm trying to provide as much edge as I can to the players who are watching me. That's my job, basically. I also try to be somewhat interesting or informative, but basically my job is to do everything I can. If there's 612 people listening, I want those 612 people to net make as much money as possible. Usually the way I can best do that is by talking about basketball and not math quite as much, because the math's really out there about a gabillion places if you want to look at it. That's not to say, I mean, it's always difficult because there are some people who are just looking at you to give them the math. So I feel the need to have myself or the co-host go through, this is an excellent matchup. They are 29th in rebounding. There is this, and actually go through the nuts. But I also want to spend a lot of time talking about the basketball because that's, sort of an edge in that there are a lot of people playing who have all the math and don't have the knowledge behind it. So you're trying to find something to set you apart. That's the only way you can find an advantage. You can't get caught up in chasing the right lineup multiple times a week. I look at the winning lineup and think, nope, I would never play that guy, and I don't think that was a good play. Well, right. So, again, this just depends whether or not you're playing, smaller tournaments or gigantor tournaments. More frequently, so to back up a step, just to the basic game theory of the thing, due to how top-heavy the prize pools are in all guaranteed tournaments, even ones that only pay 15% to first place, if it's got $1 million prize pool and it gives $150,000 to first place, you need to give yourself some reasonable shot of getting that first place, or it's a really bad bet. Now you're paying the 15% rake and another 15% rake because you've counted yourself out of ever getting first place. If you don't think your lineup is distinct enough to get in the top 10 places without possibly sharing 200 ways, like if you're just playing the Uber Chalk, they're legit bad contests. You're hoping to min cash at that point. So, yes, there are times you look at a lineup that takes the whole thing down and it has 0.1% owned, 0.4% owned, and 1.2% owned, and you think, oh yeah, there's no way I was throwing that beast out there. Yes, there is a line there. If you were playing correctly, you probably should occasionally look at a lineup and go, wow, that's way too chalky, and also occasionally look at a lineup and go, wow, that one's fucking insane. If both those things don't happen, then yeah, you're probably deviated a little too far on one side to be appropriately building lineups. But, basic guaranteed contest theory structure, you would want to make sure that you are giving yourself a shot to take everything down. Is it counterproductive to match the field with ownership on a player? No, if you think the ownership is appropriate. Like, if you're in that, Kristaps is injured, Kyle O'Quinn is going to start, and you think he's going to be 50% owned, and you think there's a real chance he could bust, but there's a real chance he could be huge, and you just want to you don't want to make that a point on which you stand and go 0 100%, or go way under or way over, and you're just like, I don't want to remove this from the equation, I think he's going to be about half owned, I'm going to own him halfway, that's fine. It's obviously wrong if you think the ownership is, wrong relative to how the guy is going to produce. But no, there's times I talk with people on live shows and they're like, yeah, I think I'm about 40%, he's going to be about 40%, I feel fine with that, and that seems right to me to do the match. Great, hey, if you profited through MLB especially, that's an incredibly tough job. If you look at people who've played, like, if you grabbed everyone who has played at least 20 days a month for the 5 months of MLB and stuck them in a room and said, what percentage of you are up any significant amount of money? The answer is a single-digit number. So if you're in that number, you've done very, very well. Seems like reviewing winning lineup instead of what is optimal could develop bad habits. Well, both of them could develop bad habits. And again, this is, sometimes the optimal lineup is going to be very, very relevant, and there was no one there who there wasn't a good reason to play. And sometimes someone got hurt, and there's a guy in there who there was no reason to play. So it's unfortunately a bit of a case by case basis type thing. Only because you have limited finished in the top of a couple GPPs, though. Well, yeah, that's going to come down to it if you're playing GPPs. I mean, you will, I get in a conversation frequently where people discuss the merits of saying, I am a X time live final qualifier as a qualification to do what we do, and I think in a similar situation I would mention the same thing. So I think it's normal because there is a certain percentage of the population who thinks it's great. But if everyone had perfect knowledge and acted logically, I think everyone would understand that that's just a function of volume. Like, do you have to be good to win a live qualifier? Probably. Pretty hard to be terrible and win the queue and then win the live final itself, for example. That's pretty unlikely. But again, those are contests that can be really tough to get back to even on. So it's fine to do it because you're going to have some fun. It's fine to do it because it's going to build your resume. If you want to do what I do and you want to look cool, so you're willing to sacrifice some EV and some ROI to put a dot on your resume, sure, it makes sense. But for a lot of people, playing milli makers and qualifiers is not the best way to build a bankroll. Nothing's ever right or wrong, but if your goal is I'm going to play contests and make money, you have milli makers that are giving 30% of their prizes to first place, and a lot of people are just getting investment plus 50% back. I remember one time just before I quit, I had I want to say 60 tickets to a golf milli maker or something, and I put them all in there, and I cashed something like 37, and if I'd have bought the 60 tickets, I wouldn't have broken even, which was simply amazing to me because, again, it just gets so concentrated at the top. You gotta get lucky in bank. And many contests are like that, where you want to play as well as you can to put yourself in a position to get lucky. You can't judge wins based on how good you are. Wins are going to come more or less largely at random. I had basically only about 3 big days in my career because I didn't play GPPs nearly as heavy as I played cash, where I randomly spiked the best lineup on the site and had a $75,000 day, and that's really amazing when you can do it. But you have to put yourself in a position to win. To use card gaming as a concept, you'll see a guy in the World Series of Poker and they'll be like, oh, he got so lucky to pull that card. It's like, yeah, but he was only in the hand because he was good, or he only had enough chips to capitalize on it because he was good. So you have to put yourself in a position to take advantage of the luck that will eventually come your way. Is leverage undervalued in tournaments? Probably, because I don't think people properly understand the concept. I'm not even sure exactly what you mean. When I think of leverage, I think of, playing, if Kyle O'Quinn is the chalk for playing for the Knicks, it's playing Luke Cornett, who has himself some sort of decent upside if he gets some playing time, and if Kyle O'Quinn twists and turns an ankle, or fouls out in 9 minutes, randomly gets to play 35 minutes, and you're in this situation where picking him as a play has its own advantageous upside, but additionally counters what the rest of the field is doing. For cash, the top plays are just pricing inefficiencies and building a 55th plus percentile lineup. But GPPs, it's about widening your range of outcomes, maximizing on correlative events, and levering ownership. Yeah, I think that's a very good theme sense. That would be a good description for a show. But especially if there's super chalk and you have other conviction on the slate, if there's a 15% player that you love and the cock is going to be 45% owned and you don't have a true lean. Sure, I agree with that. Again, going back to our conversation about matching the chalk percentages. Any further questions? Did another 15 minutes of questions. Doing good. I do think we have a very well-informed panel here. Like I wish I should have opened up Skype and thrown everybody in there and had a roundtable conversation, because there's some smart dudes in this chat who I enjoy even when I don't agree with. Like being challenged, too. Like being wrong. When people say you're wrong, ask how. Find out. Don't defend yourself. one of the most curious human instincts. When you want more knowledge, and more knowledge equals more money, and someone says, you're wrong, you should have done this, people just go off and don't listen. You should want to know why. Because one of two things is right. Either you are right, and that'll become evident, and the guy had nothing to tell you, and you don't need to be a dick, or the guy is actually right, which is going to happen. I don't care who you are, and you should be grateful for the feedback. So unless the guy is coming over the top and being a dick to start, yeah, I'm a huge fan of, constructively soliciting feedback from others. All right, so we will learn. Learning should be a lifetime process, as it is. To step out into, philosophy, if you will, a little bit here. In your entire life, people are really, learning should be a lifetime process. And, self-analysis is good shit. People stop trying to learn when they're 18 or 22, 25. I know a lot of random shit, and I'd like to think it's because I'm intelligent, but it's also because whenever I don't know something, I look it up. If I have a conversation with someone and they say something I don't know, I ask them to tell me what it is. Whenever I'm reading an article, if someone's mentioned, I don't know who it is, I look that person up. So, yeah, stepping back. So, thanks everyone. I'm going to step out for the day. Probably do this again Tuesday. Going to try to go just about every other day. News, I'm going to be up in Chicago on probably the 10th, 11th, 12th. For about 2 days there, we're going to get together. We're going to do some indoor golf. We're going to do some beer games. We're going to do some beer pong, some ping pong, some foosball, maybe some karaoke. I think we're going to get together at a gym at some point. So if you're watching and you happen to be from the greater Chicago area, stay tuned to the Twitter feed. And hopefully you can come out and meet us. Always like to meet you guys face to face. So with that, I am Fast Eddie Fear. I will see you again soon.